This is U.S. History 1, PowerPoint Lecture 2.3, Part 2, a continuation of the Jacksonian era. And we had, just kind of to recap here, we brought us up to the 1836 election and the election of Martin Van Buren. And what we said was that by 1836, Jackson had more or less alienated all of his political allies as a result of his pursuit of these personal vendettas against Calhoun and Clay. And as a result of, generally speaking, Jackson was seen as relatively authoritarian and arbitrary. And so he'd upset a lot of people. Van Buren will stand as the Democratic candidate in 36, and really the only reason he wins, Martin Van Buren is not a particularly popular fellow. He lacks kind of the presidential charisma necessary, but at that time there's really no alternative to him. Counterparty, a rival of the Democratic Party, really hadn't risen up. It will rise up over the next 4 years and be encapsulated and crystallized in the Whig Party, which we'll take a look at in a minute here. And so Jackson's out. Van Buren comes in, and Van Buren absolutely just inherits an absolute nightmare that was largely created by Jackson, and more significantly, created by Jackson's ill-conceived banking policy. Remember, with Jackson, just kind of to recap, we had set up the independent treasury system in which he took all of the government money that previously had been in the National Bank, which he killed, and took it out and put it into pet banks, and then took all of the government specie, which is gold and silver, and locked it away in these pet banks. Okay, and that's the independent treasury system. Now, in addition to that, he passes the specie circular, which calls for all land purchases to be done in gold and silver, in specie. Well, the problem with that is you have, during this period now, in the mid-1830s and beyond, you have a massive westward expansion. And so you're going to have massive land speculation, okay, both because of the Indian Removal Act, which frees up all that land really in Alabama and Mississippi and Illinois, all the way, east of the Mississippi. And then you have the entire Louisiana Purchase, which is going to become available. And so you have a massive increase in the demand for land at a time when Jackson locks away and reduces the supply of gold and silver, and then insists that it be bought with gold and silver. And so this is going to place an unusual strain on the banking system. And you see here at the bottom here that at the same time there is in fact an increase in the amount of specie in terms of silver from Mexico, but this is going to be insufficient. This is going to be insufficient to cover the needs based on this land speculation, and the land speculation is not going to be the only thing we'll take a look at. Now, the Panic of 1837, which will ultimately turn into the first depression, outright depression in U.S. history, the panic creates a recession, and just kind of technically speaking, the difference between a depression and a recession is a depression is a recession that lasts for 2 consecutive quarters. A recession is negative growth. Okay, it's when the economy shrinks. A depression is when that condition exists for greater than 6 months. And so this will become a depression in 1839, from which the United States will not really recover. Okay, they'll modestly recover in the 1850s. Then the war between the states will happen, which will force them to reboot pretty much the entire economic and financial structure of the United States. But it won't fix some of the structural issues, and then the economy will boil down again in the 1890s. But at any rate, the panic in 1837 is going to be your first international banking crisis. Okay, and again, it's created by Jackson's policies. As I've said before, okay, and as we now reiterate, Jackson locks up the gold and silver. Okay, so there's an insufficient supply to meet demand for it, principally because of land speculation, but not only because of land speculation. Well, to compensate for the lack of gold and silver in the American system, the American banks borrow specie, gold and silver, from British banks. That will increase the supply of gold and silver in the U.S. and help meet this increased demand from the land speculation. And that's a reasonable enough idea. That's all well and good, except for one thing. That leaves the British with an insufficient supply of gold and silver themselves. And so British importers of American cotton specifically, don't have enough gold and silver and therefore don't have enough money to buy Southern cotton. Okay, with me so far? We understand how this works? The British banks lend out their gold and silver to American banks because of Jackson's policy of limiting the gold and silver supply in the U.S. As a result, the British banks themselves are short of reserves to lend to their importers who are importing American cotton. As a result, they can't import American cotton anymore, which means the demand for American cotton in Britain collapses. Now, when that collapses, and this we've talked about before, if you remember that discussion we had of the credit system, when demand for Southern cotton collapses, the influx of money to the South collapses, okay? When they're not selling their cotton overseas, their money in, we talk about the terms of trade, their money in goes precipitously down to the point where they can no longer finance their debt to the American banks. And that's what's going to create the panic. Okay? A panic is when bank reserves suddenly bottom out. Okay? In U.S. history, too, we talk about this a lot, both in the 1890s and then with the Great Depression. Okay, so bank reserves bottom out, and people then rush to the banks for fear that their deposits are going to be gone, are not going to come back. And so they try to get out whatever money they can, and this further exacerbates the problem. This is referred to as a bank run. And in the 1930s, this happens precipitously from 32 through 34. But at any rate, here what we have, and just kind of to reiterate this again, it's not complicated. It's a really simple, basic idea. The British banks lend the American banks gold and silver because the American banks have an insufficient supply because of the specie circular and the independent treasury system. Okay, that's step one. Step two, this leaves the British banks with insufficient money to lend out to British importers to buy American cotton. That's step two. Step three, as a result of this, the South, which is the cotton producers in the United States, their money in drops because demand for cotton in Britain collapses. Okay? This means less money in. That's step three. Step four, as a result of this, they're unable to finance their debt to American banks, which puts the American banks belly up. Simple enough? Okay. Now, the crisis, it says here that, the crisis endures and becomes a depression in 1939. It's overall then in the 1830s, we have a contraction of the American economy. This contraction of the American economy, coupled with some other things that we'll get into in just a second here, is going to lead to the collapse of the Democratic Party, at least temporarily. It's going to lead to the demise of them in the late 1830s. Martin Van Buren, not a particularly popular fellow, not a particularly charismatic fellow, is going to come in 1836. Okay? Take office in 1837, the same year that the panic hits. And the Democrats, and Van Buren specifically, Van Buren is at the helm of the ship when the ship begins to list over to the side, risking capsize, to use a metaphor. Okay, Van Buren is in command when the banking crisis hits. All right. And so the banking crisis will be largely and somewhat unfairly blamed on him. Now, the only thing for which we could potentially hold him responsible is he didn't do anything to prevent it. What he could have done to prevent it was end the independent treasury system and get rid of the specie circular, which would allow for this land speculation and infrastructure development and manufacturing expansion to continue with the borrowing of paper currency instead of the strain on the limited supply of specie. He could have done that, and so for that he holds a certain amount of responsibility. But in terms of the preconditions that set up this banking crisis, he had nothing to do with it. He wasn't even in office. That was Jackson, okay, who really didn't understand economics at all. I mean, he was an Indian fighter and war hero, so what the hell does he know about running an economy? Uh, so Van Buren gets blamed for that. The Democrats get blamed for that. That's one of the things that's going to cost them the White House and overall control of the government. Okay, now the other thing, which we've seen before, we saw it with the Federalists. There's a split in the party. We saw it with the Republicans. There's a split in the party, and they alienate their power base. The Democrats come into office in 1828 on a platform of limited national government, states' rights. That's what they come in on. Jackson spearheads the betrayal of this position. Not only does he massively expand the power of the national government, okay, through things like the Force Bill and the Indian Removal Act, okay, but he also expands the power of the presidency. He uses the veto 12 times, largely to carry on these personal vendettas. He turns the White House into more or less his palace, okay, and takes on an extraordinarily authoritarian and dictatorial approach to the presidency. This alienates the power base that called for limited national government. It also indicates that the Democratic Party itself, with Jackson, splits. You still have this original wing of the Democratic Party, okay, that was contrary to the nationalists and the Republicans, that was this recurring theme through American history in favor of a limited national government, in favor of states' rights. And as I've said before, we will see this, and this is just another uh, uh, iteration of this dialectic that goes on really until the 1950s in the United States between limited national government and strong national government, between states' rights and national sovereignty. Okay? And so Jackson is going to spearhead a split in the party. He will come to represent a strong nationalist position, strong central government. Well, that alienates the states' rights people in the Democratic Party and splits the party. Okay? Another key element of this, which we really didn't have in the Republicans, we had it with the National Republicans. It was one of the things that cost John Quincy Adams a second term. It was one of the things that was used as a criticism against the National Republicans, was how this election of 1824 worked and how it was a backroom deal and how corrupt the overall process was. Well, as corrupt as that might appear, and it's kind of ironic that Jackson was the one that pointed to the corruption, that that so alleged and criticized the National Republicans for being corrupt, when he himself was by far the most corrupt president uh, during this period. Okay, so they're going to come under criticism now for the corruption under Jackson. That Jackson used the presidency to pursue personal vendettas. That he himself became kind of a power hungry, almost monarchic kind of individual, kind of personality. and used the government, his position as president, to pursue his own personal agenda. In addition to that, he really had no economic policy. His foreign policy we could devolve into anti-Indian and the Indian Removal Act. Economically, he really didn't understand economics, at least not at the macro level. He didn't understand how the U.S. government worked. And so he'll torpedo the national bank, which gives up control over the monetary supply. And then he passes these bizarre ideas of the specie circular and the independent treasury system. Now, in and of itself, the specie circular may not have been that bad. It would have prevented the inflationary trend in land speculation, because with demand for land going up, there's going to be a natural rise in the price of land. And if you force it to be bought with gold and silver, that'll reduce the demand and keep down inflation a little bit. So in and of itself, the specie circular may not have been that bad. But when you add it to the independent treasury system, which locks away all the government gold and silver in these pet banks, then you've got no supply at all. And so that's what's going to ultimately create that panic. And so all in all, these things are going to lead to the demise of the Democrats. As we've said before, that in and of itself is not sufficient to cost a political party their control over the government. Okay, as we had before with the Federalists and with the Republicans, what we see is a split in the party and an alienation of their power base. Okay, less with the Federalists than the Republicans, but we still have a certain alienation of the power base. With the Democrats, they've alienated their power base. There's been a split in the party between the nationalists and the states' rights people. Okay, those two in and of themselves are necessary conditions to cost a political party its control over the government. They are not, however, the sufficient condition. Okay, the sufficient condition, necessary and sufficient, the sufficient condition, those two in and of themselves, the party split and the alienation of the base, would not have been enough to cost the Democrats the White House. What's going to cost them the White House is, during this period, the late 1830s, an alternative political party is going to crystallize really behind Henry Clay. Okay, really behind Henry Clay, and then mobilize behind William Henry Harrison. Okay, now, so we have this polarization once again, as we mentioned before, between states' rights and nationalists. The Whigs, for their part, are going to be the first really adept political manipulative party. I mean, yes, John Quincy Adams cuts a deal with Henry Clay that gets him the presidency, but the Whigs are going to manipulate, are going to maneuver politically on a macro level, okay, throughout the entire system. And we'll see that in just a second, how they do that. It has to do with forming an alliance. But Henry Clay, this is now the election of 1840. Henry Clay is not a particularly popular individual. He's too outspoken. He's pressed for this nationalist agenda too much. And so he himself is really not a particularly electable candidate. He's going to borrow, okay, and this is the first real politically adept move. He did it really in 1824, but he himself ran for presidency. This is going to be the first time he outright does this. He's going to borrow a page from the Democratic Party's playbook. He's going to borrow an idea from Martin Van Buren. Okay, in the election of 1828, Martin Van Buren realized that he himself, the leader of the Albany Regency and the leader of the Democratic Party, was not a particularly electable individual. And so he searched high and low for a charismatic, popular figure, and he found Andrew Jackson. Well, Henry Clay is going to do the same thing. He's going to search high and low for someone who he can kind of dress up nicely and present to the American people, And this is really, we see it really for the first time with Jackson. And it's one of the things that irritates me more than anything else is how we're gearing up towards a presidential election here in the United States next year. Okay. And it always bothers the hell out of me how the presidential election is done. Because the way it's done is these candidates are dressed up and presented to the American people much in the way that advertisers present a product. They sell us the president the same way they sell us the new improved laundry soap. Okay? And that's what they're going to do here. We see it with Andrew Jackson. Okay, Andrew Jackson was a popular war hero, a charismatic individual, a charismatic figure, and so we're going to put him up there to lead us. And actually, really, when you think about it, now that I think about it, the first time they do this is when Alexander Hamilton picks George Washington to run for the presidency. They've done this all along. This is what the president is. Okay? The president is a pretty boy. That's all. They're a pretty face to show the people in the hopes that they're going to. But in terms of the decision-making process, with Washington, he had virtually nothing to do with anything the Federalists did. Jackson is different. And I think Van Buren underestimated that. He underestimated Jackson's personality. Jackson was not the same animal as George Washington. George Washington was indecisive, fairly pliable. Okay, Jackson wasn't. Okay, and Van Buren should have known better. Well, Henry Clay, for his part, will borrow from the same idea. He'll do the same thing, and he'll pick William Henry Harrison. Okay, if you remember, William Henry Harrison is the war hero of the War of 1812. Now, all well and good. Okay, another selection, just like Andrew Jackson, just like George Washington, another selection of a war hero. Okay, charismatic, popular figure. The problem is that William Henry Harrison was the hero of the War of 1812. It's now 1840. Okay, that's 28 years later. William Henry Harrison is 2 years older than dirt. Okay, he's the last living human being that knows Methuselah. Okay, he's an old man. He's decrepit. Now, it might be, there's really not sufficient evidence to support this hypothesis, but it might be, okay, speculative now, it might be that Clay chose him specifically for that reason. He's an old man. Old men are pliable, okay? As long as you make sure that they're, they get a drawn bath, and they get sponge baths, and as long as they've got their television and crackers, they're easy to ply. They're easy to deal with. They're not strong personalities. Okay, and it might be that Henry Clay chose him for that reason. Okay, because then he would be able to manipulate Harrison and press his agenda. All right, so he chooses Henry Harrison. Now, just kind of before we move on, let's just recap on the evolution of this American political system. And without getting into it tangentially too much, what we have here is the evolution of the two-party system. And remember, in each case, you have a polarization in American politics. You have on one side a group advocating a strong national government, and on the other side, you have one that is in favor of limited national government and states' rights. We see this for the first time with the Federalists and Republicans. The Republicans stand for states' rights, limited national government. The Federalists are the nationalists. Then we have the National Republicans, who were the split in the Republican Party. This is the nationalist wing of the Republican Party. Okay, well, they're going to be opposed by the Democrats, who stand for limited national government and states' rights. Then there's this split in the Democrats. Okay, and so when we talk about the Democratic Party in 1840, you have two entirely opposed wings. You have one, which are the Jacksonian Democrats, which are in favor of a strong national government. And then you have the states' rights, the original base of the Democratic Party. And they'll go up against the Whigs, who for their part are in favor of a strong national government. And so in 1840, William Henry Harrison, the hero of the War of 1812, will go up against Martin Van Buren, who is largely blamed for the economic crisis through which the United States is still going. There has been no solution, and in fact will be no solution to the crisis. And so the Whigs will sweep into the White House under William Henry Harrison. The problem is, well, you know what? We'll get there in just a second. Let's go over the platform of the Whigs. We see here there's two things. One is the objection to this kind of what they refer to as mob rule of Jackson. Now, what that means is Jackson was a populist. Jackson filled the White House with his buddies. Okay, literally it became kind of a party. The Whigs are elitists. The Whigs are really, if you really want to extend it, okay, and push it as far as it can possibly push, the Whigs are really the holdover of those old Federalists. They are wealthy. They are entrepreneurs and landowners. They are well-educated. And so they're this elitist group. But they've gained in popularity because of the effects of Jackson's kind of hoi polloi common democracy. Okay? When you bring the common people into the White House, that's what you get. Okay? You get economic catastrophe and the kind of corruption that we see with Jackson. And that's the point kind of that the Whigs press home. Now, I mentioned that the Whigs will demonstrate a certain adeptness in maneuvering politically. That adeptness is going to be in an alliance that they form. Okay? They're going to take advantage of the split that has taken place in the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has split between the nationalist Jacksonians and the original wing of the Democratic Party, which stood for states' rights and limited national government. Okay? To co-opt that wing, that liberal wing of the Democratic Party, okay, to co-opt that liberal wing and bring them into the Whig Party, they're going to select as William Henry Harrison's running mate, John Tyler. John Tyler has made his reputation by being a pro-states' rights Democrat, okay, in favor of limited national government. And so by pulling him in as your vice presidential candidate, that does in fact make the Whig Party more popular with the states' rights people, who ordinarily should hate this party, okay? The problem is that you've brought him in as a vice president for a president who is old and decrepit and could die at any moment, in which case Tyler would take over, he'd become the president. That creates a problem, and it will in fact create a problem. Okay, now in terms of their platform, we've seen this before. The Whig Party's platform is created, the architect of that platform is Henry Clay. Once again, they're going to push for this American system, which is government subsidization of industry and infrastructure development. Okay, we're going to see an expansion of the paper money supply and an abandonment of the specie circular. This will increase the supply of money and allow for expansion in the economy. Idea being that this will end the depression that has set in 1839. They are pro-tariff and pro-protectionism. They want to cultivate the American manufacturing sector by protecting it against foreign competition. We've seen this before. This is very reminiscent of the nationalist wing, the high Federalists, particularly under Hamilton. It's very similar to Jeffersonian republicanism, okay, or Monrovian republicanism under James Monroe. Okay, so this platform appeals to the American elite. It appeals to the entrepreneurs, to the businesses, a little less so to large landholders. Okay, because they're dependent on foreign trade for their livelihood. So it's really, this is going to be the first party of big business. The problem comes out almost immediately. William Henry Harrison. This is during a time. It's a relatively recent phenomenon. Not recent. I mean recent in historical terms. That the president takes office in January after the year he's elected. In 1840, the typical way was that the president would take over in March, would be inaugurated in March of the next year. Okay, so Harrison will be inaugurated in March of 41. The problem is they do the inauguration outside, and it's raining, and he catches pneumonia, and literally the next day he has to go into a sick bed. He will never recover from that sick bed. He will not be outside again in his life. He dies 30 days later, which makes him the president that serves the least amount of time in office, 30 days. Which means, that the Whigs have outsmarted themselves. Because, according to the Constitution, when Harrison dies, John Tyler will take over as president. Which means that he'll be the first vice president to succeed a president, among other things. But John Tyler is anti-nationalist. He is in favor of states' rights and a limited national government. This is exactly what the Whigs did not want to have happen. Okay? And so Henry Clay and the Whigs really outsmarted themselves. They get this populist war hero who just happens to be 2 years older than dirt into the White House. And one of the main reasons they get him into the White House is because they've aligned themselves with the states' rights wing of the Democratic Party by pulling Tyler in as his running mate. So you've got the best of both worlds until Harrison dies. How could they not foresee Harrison dying? He's an old man. Anything, a stiff wind would kill him. But at any rate, that's Henry Clay for you. Okay. Tyler now takes over. And sure enough, the Whigs who control the House hammer through this American system of subsidization of American manufacturing expansion, national subsidization of infrastructure development. It'll come across Tyler's desk. Tyler vetoes it. They have insufficient support in Congress to pass over his veto, and so the American system, this national government subsidization of manufacturing, the national government subsidization of infrastructure development, is torpedoed. Okay? On 2 occasions, the Whigs will propose chartering a new national bank to give the national government some control over the supply of money. On 2 occasions, Tyler will veto this rechartering. The Whigs stood for protective tariffs to protect the development of the American manufacturing industry. Okay, the American manufacturing sector. They'll pass a tariff in 1842. Tyler will veto that. Okay? Now, aside from these vetoes, aside from torpedoing every Whig idea at how to stimulate the economy or expand the economy or increase the money supply, expand the power of the national government, expand the control of the national government, he torpedoes all of these. But other than that, Tyler himself has no idea whatsoever how to solve the economic crisis that has hit the United States. And so he is going to develop a tactic, a brilliant tactic, a tactic that will work beautifully, a tactic that will, from this point forward, this is the first time it's used. He creates it. He invents it. He develops it. Okay? And for that, he's given kudos. I give him kudos for this because it's a brilliant political tactic. And it will be used repeatedly throughout U.S. history, all the way to modern times. Obama did it. Bush did it. Okay? When the economy's in the dumper and you're not doing well, at recovering it. It's not showing any signs of being revived. What you do is a sort of sleight of hand, almost a magic show. You distract the attention of the American people. You distract their attention from the deplorable domestic conditions, particularly in the economy, by getting them to focus on foreign affairs. You create a foreign crisis. Tyler will create two, one of which really isn't very viable. Okay, the ongoing dispute or the ongoing negotiations to solidify the border with Canada with Great Britain. That's not going to get much traction. That one doesn't have a lot of play to it. The one that has a lot of play to it is the Texas issue, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But that's what he's going to bring up. Now, the first one he deals with, he'll deal with in the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. And as I said, the dispute with Great Britain and Canada, really there's not a lot of traction to it. Okay, the United States has gone to open conflict with Britain twice, once in the Revolution, once in the War of 1812. On neither occasion did they do all that well. When they won their independence, they came to a draw in the War of 1812, so people really aren't interested in another militarized conflict with Great Britain. The British have been relatively calm with the United States since they kind of normalized relations in 1818 after the War of 1812, and so for the last 20 years or so, the British and the United States have gotten along quite well. They've expanded trade relations, etc., etc. So there's really not a lot of traction. You can't really get people behind. You can't really rally people behind the dispute with Great Britain. And so they're going to sign the Webster-Ashburton Treaty in 1842, which is going to settle the border in the east between the eastern United States, really Maine, and British-held Canada. However, Tyler searches for something behind which he can rally the American people, and he finds Texas. Okay, now in the 1820s, and we'll get into the details of this a little bit later, maybe in the next lecture, I think. But the U.S. begins to expand in Texas. Texas is part of the Mexican Empire. Okay, Mexico itself becomes an empire in the 1820s. And just kind of to back it up again, I'll back it up again later, but just kind of to stick it out there now. The entirety of Central America, that entire isthmus, was under the control of Spain until 1824, when it was granted its independence. It was known at that point as the Kingdom of Guatemala. Well, they become independent republics, which are quickly gobbled up in the 1820s by Mexico, the largest of them. Okay? While Mexico is doing that during the 1820s, they're devoting their resources south to controlling the Isthmus of Panama. Okay? Which means they're not committing a lot of resources to their northern frontier. Now, the northern frontier of the Spanish possessions, which are inherited by Mexico, are what are today the American Southwest and Texas. Well, they're not devoting a lot of resources to that. The population is not very great. And so if we look at Texas, the population isn't very large there. And so Americans, known as Tejanos, will start or known as impresarios, will start to move into Texas. And they'll actually be given land grants by Mexico to repopulate the area. And so they'll start moving into Texas. Well, this gives the Americans a foothold in Texas. Okay, and that's ultimately going to be the leadership. We're moving in the direction now of the very famous Battle of the Alamo and Sam Houston's War. We're moving in that direction. Santa Anna, who becomes famous in the Alamo, will come to power in Mexico in 1833, and he'll take on dictatorial control in 1835. Texas will proclaim its independence from Mexico in March of 1836, and that's what's going to commence the rebellion that will lead to both the Alamo and Goliad. Okay, In 1844, the United States is going to secretly annex Texas. They don't tell anybody about it, and that's kind of like what I did some years back, as a result of numerous violations of international law and the United Nations Charter. I secretly, hush, keep it quiet. I secretly seceded from the United States. Yeah, I'm now an independent sovereign republic. Nobody really recognizes that. I've applied now 3 times. I've petitioned the United Nations for a seat in the General Assembly, and they've turned me down. They don't recognize me, but that's okay. Just like nobody recognizes the United States annexation of Texas because they don't tell anybody. Um, Now, under the conditions of the Missouri Compromise, however, and that's the last point that I make here, is Texas would be allowed to enter the Union as a slaveholding state. Okay, so this sets us up for the Texas issue. Okay, and Tyler's main thrust in international relations. In the midst of all this, as Tyler is rallying the people behind an American push into Texas, which would create a potential war with Mexico, as he's pushing them in that direction and distracting their attention from the fact that he's done absolutely nothing to solve the economic crisis, which has now continued to endure. Okay? In the midst of all that, the election of 1844 comes up. Now, Tyler's in serious trouble with this election because on the first part, what we talked about before, with the vetoing of the American system, with the vetoing of subsidization of the American manufacturing industry or sector, and the national subsidization of infrastructure development, with the torpedoing of the national bank, with the torpedoing of the tariff, with doing everything in his power to limit the power of the national government. He's betrayed the Whigs. He stabbed them right in the back. The Whigs brought it on themselves. The Whigs should have known better than bringing him in as the vice presidential candidate. And hindsight's 2020. They felt they had to do this in order to win the election in 1840, and maybe that's right. Maybe they did. Okay, but it came back to bite them in the ass, so to speak. It came back to haunt them when Tyler takes over as president after Harrison dies. And so he's betrayed the Whigs, and so he's lost any support from the Whig Party. They turn their back on it. Well, by the same token, he can't now turn to the other political party, the Democrats, because he became the vice presidential candidate of a Whig. He betrayed the Democratic Party. He turncoated. Okay, he became a Whig long enough and in name only to become the vice presidential candidate, to get him one step closer to the White House. And so the Democrats see him as a turncoat. And so he's literally alienated both viable political parties. And so politically, Tyler, by the election of 1844, Tyler is dead in the water. Okay? Stick a fork in him. He's gone belly up. Okay? He's betrayed everybody. He's betrayed the Whigs and he's betrayed the Democrats. The Democrats then will select James K. Polk as their presidential candidate. The Whigs, for their part, are in pretty desperate shape here. All right? Because the fact of the matter is, at this point, they're not going to be able to search the country high and low and find someone like William Henry Harrison or Andrew Jackson, or George Washington, a famous, popular, charismatic war hero. They're not going to find one because they're all dead. William Henry Harrison was the last of them. And so, lacking some populist, charismatic figure to serve as the figurehead of the party to run for the presidency, who do they have? Henry Clay? Henry Clay is not particularly well liked. He's very controversial. He's well known as a strong nationalist. Okay? The Whigs have had 4 years to try to solve the economic crisis, and they've done nothing. Okay? So in the election of 44, Polk will run against Henry Clay, Henry Clay is not particularly well liked. James Polk isn't all that well known, but as a reaction more than anything else to the Whigs, they're going to elect James Polk in 1844. And we'll pick up right there in the next lecture. We'll pick up with James Polk and the Texas issue and the expansion into the Mexican War of 1848. Join me then.